What do a medieval king, Wall Street bankers, and Argentina's middle class have in common? They've all fallen victim to financial catastrophes that, surprisingly, look nearly identical, despite being centuries and continents apart. The 2008 housing crash wasn't the first of its kind. In fact, it was just the latest chapter in a long story of economic collapses that stretch back to King Edward III's 1340 default, an event that toppled the most powerful banking system in Florence. If that shocks you, it should. Because history doesn't just rhyme, it repeats, and financial crises are its most persistent chorus. Economist Carmen Reinhart and Harvard professor Kenneth Rogoff, who studied over 8 centuries of financial history, famously wrote, "This time is different are the four most costly words in economics." Their groundbreaking research revealed a haunting truth: domestic debt, once thought safe, can be just as destructive as borrowing from foreign creditors. Whether it's 14th century coin clipping or today's money printing, the mechanisms may evolve, but the consequences remain eerily consistent. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So how does this happen over and over again? Think of financial systems like towering dams holding back rivers of credit. When confidence holds, the structure is solid. But once trust erodes, even slightly, the floodgates open. Modern banks, no matter how sophisticated, often operate on confidence more than cash. Once panic sets in, liquidity evaporates, and institutions collapse, just like they did in ancient Florence or during the 2008 meltdown. The dangerous illusion of stability blinds both policymakers and the public until it's too late. But here's the real question: if the warning signs are visible and the patterns repeat, why don't we listen? Overconfidence, political pressure, short-term thinking, it all plays a role. Leaders cling to the belief that this time really is different. But the historical record says otherwise. From currency debasement to sovereign defaults and banking failures, the symptoms remain the same. So, are we doomed to repeat history, or can we finally learn from it? The answer lies in awareness and accountability. If we understand the cycles, we can strengthen our financial systems, demand transparency from institutions, and challenge the narratives that lead us into crisis. If you found this eye-opening, like, share, and subscribe to empower others with this timeless wisdom. Because understanding financial history, identifying debt crisis patterns, and protecting our future with economic foresight is more than knowledge, it's a responsibility. About the authors. Carmen Reinhart, a leading expert in global finance, is a professor of international financial systems at Harvard Kennedy School and formerly held the role of chief economist at the World Bank. Kenneth Rogoff, a renowned economist and policy thinker, serves as professor of economics and public policy at Harvard University and previously acted as chief economist for the International Monetary Fund. Together, they bring unmatched insight into the history and mechanics of financial crises. Key takeaway 1. Sovereign debt crises explained: why countries keep defaulting, from medieval kings to modern markets. In 2001, Argentina defaulted on a staggering $93 billion in debt, sending shockwaves across the nation and the world. Banks shut their doors, unemployment soared above 25%, and middle-class families were suddenly scavenging for food in the streets. But as catastrophic as it was, Argentina's crisis wasn't unique. It was the latest act in a centuries-old drama that has haunted global finance since the Middle Ages. From the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe to Wall Street's glass towers, sovereign debt crises have followed a chillingly familiar pattern of overborrowing, denial, and collapse. As Reinhart and Rogoff detail in their landmark research, history is full of eerie echoes. The most dangerous phrase in economics, they warn, is "this time is different." One of the earliest examples dates back to 1340, when King Edward III of England defaulted on massive debts to Florentine bankers to fund his war with France. The result? Financial ruin for Italy's most powerful banks and Europe's first international banking crisis. These collapses aren't just historical footnotes, they are economic warning signs we continue to ignore. So, what exactly is a sovereign debt crisis? At its core, it's what happens when a country can't repay foreign lenders, triggering a domino effect of economic instability, social unrest, and sometimes even political transformation. Think of it like maxing out a national credit card, except instead of cutting back on shopping, entire populations suffer. From Napoleonic-era defaults to the emerging market meltdowns of the 1980s and 90s, this cycle has played out repeatedly, regardless of time or region. And when national leaders treat debt as infinite, the reckoning is rarely gentle. But if these crises are so predictable, why do they keep happening? Is it arrogance? Short-term political gain? Or the seductive illusion that global lenders will always bail countries out? Take Newfoundland in the 1930s, for instance. Facing a debt spiral during the Great Depression, this small dominion gave up its independence and reverted to British rule just to avoid default. Fast forward to 1989, and the Brady bonds emerged as a lifeline, ingenious debt restructuring backed by U.S. Treasuries. Do these solutions cure the disease or just manage the symptoms? And more importantly, are we building systems that learn, or merely survive until the next disaster? Understanding the patterns of sovereign debt is more than financial trivia, it's a crucial step toward building more resilient economies. These stories teach us that economic history matters, that global financial systems are fragile, and that every nation, no matter how powerful, can fall victim to poor financial judgment. If this story opened your eyes to the cycles we keep repeating, don't keep it to yourself to keep these critical conversations alive. Because staying informed isn't just smart, it's empowering. Key takeaway 2. Why domestic debt crises can be just as dangerous as foreign defaults. When we think of economic meltdowns, we often imagine massive foreign debts drowning fragile nations. But what if the real danger is much closer to home? In reality, domestic debt crises have crippled economies, wiped out savings, and triggered revolutions. While borrowing from local lenders in the country's own currency might seem safer, history proves that internal debt can be just as catastrophic as any external default. From pre-communist China to modern Mexico, the story repeats: when governments borrow too heavily from within, the results can be explosive. Experts like Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff warn that the illusion of safety in domestic debt often lulls policymakers into dangerous complacency. Consider China in the early 20th century. After defaulting on foreign debt in 1921 and again in 1939, the government leaned heavily on domestic borrowing. But when that failed, it printed money, a decision that led to hyperinflation and economic ruin by 1949. The destruction of citizens' wealth was so severe, it helped pave the way for the communist revolution. As the authors remind us, debt intolerance has local roots, but global consequences. Imagine trying to fill a leaking bucket by pouring in more water. That's essentially what happens when governments try to inflate their way out of domestic debt. Yes, printing money might seem like an easy fix, but it quickly devalues the currency, destroys savings, and triggers social unrest. In a household, this would be like maxing out your credit card and then writing yourself IOUs, only to find out those IOUs are worthless because the grocery store won't accept them. So, why do nations keep falling into this trap? The answer often lies in desperation. For developing economies, external borrowing can seem strategic, offering lower interest rates and more credibility. But when domestic savings run dry, some countries take risky shortcuts, like issuing bonds tied to foreign currencies. Mexico's Tesobonos in 1989 are a cautionary tale. Peso-denominated bonds guaranteed at the dollar rate seemed smart, until the peso crashed in 1994, turning $29 billion in local debt into an unpayable external burden. Brazil, Argentina, and Thailand all repeated similar mistakes. So the question becomes, are we learning from history, or merely repeating it with different names and currencies? Domestic debt is not inherently evil, but treating it as risk-free is a dangerous myth. From forced loans to currency-linked instruments, internal borrowing has shaped, and shaken, financial systems for generations. Understanding this complex balance is essential for policymakers, investors, and citizens alike. Because history isn't just about the past, it's our guide to a smarter, more stable future. Key takeaway 3. Why banking crises keep repeating, and why no country is safe. In 1929, as Wall Street collapsed, so did America's trust in its banks. By 1933, over 4,000 U.S. banks had failed, evaporating life savings and paralyzing communities. Businesses couldn't pay employees, farmers couldn't plant crops, and families stood helpless as local banks shuttered overnight. This wasn't just a financial meltdown, it was a human tragedy. And nearly a century later, despite technological advances and tighter regulations, no country has fully outgrown the threat of a banking crisis. Renowned economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff emphasize that banking crises are financial earthquakes that shake even the strongest economies. From the Napoleonic era to the 2008 global crash, rich nations and developing economies alike have fallen victim to the same patterns. As former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke once observed, the financial crisis was more severe because of the collapse of the banking system. It's not just a historical pattern, it's a recurring danger. Think of banks like water towers in a city. They store and distribute financial lifeblood, credit. But banks perform a delicate trick, taking short-term deposits and converting them into long-term loans. This process, called maturity transformation, makes them vulnerable to sudden runs, when everyone demands their money at once. Just like a tower that bursts under too much pressure, a bank can collapse not because it's broke, but because it loses trust. And when multiple banks fail, the entire financial ecosystem can dry up. Why do these crises keep returning? Part of the answer lies in overconfidence and flawed policy. In countries like India during the 1970s, governments capped savings interest at 5% while inflation hit 20%, essentially robbing savers to fund the state. When governments default on their debt, banks collapse alongside them, taking citizens' savings with them. Then there's the classic bubble, easy money, soaring asset prices, reckless lending, until it all bursts. So we must ask, if we know the pattern, why does history keep catching us off guard? Banking systems are the beating heart of economies, and when that heart fails, recovery is painfully slow. Understanding how and why these crises unfold is the first step toward resilience. Let's break the cycle by staying informed, and demanding better systems. Key takeaway 4. From coin clipping to hyperinflation, why tampering with money always backfires. Imagine waking up to find that your paycheck is worthless by lunchtime. That was daily life in 1923 Germany, where prices doubled every few days and people carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Inflation isn't a modern phenomenon, it's a recurring economic plague with 1,000 faces, stretching from ancient Greece to modern-day Venezuela. Throughout history, rulers desperate to dodge debt have relied on one dangerous tool: manipulating money. This isn't new. Take Dionysius of ancient Greece, who doubled his nation's money supply by simply restamping promissory notes, or Henry VIII, who shaved silver from coins while keeping their face value intact. These tactics caused currency debasement, silently stealing purchasing power from citizens. In fact, during Henry's reign, the pound lost over 80% of its silver content, a masterclass in inflation without a printing press. Even the US suffered. During the Revolutionary War, inflation soared to 200% in 1779. Inflation is like watering down soup: you can serve more bowls, but each one is less nourishing. With the invention of paper money and the printing press, the damage became even easier to inflict. Germany's hyperinflation is infamous, but modern echoes persist. During the 1990s Asian financial crisis, collapsing currencies led people to abandon their own money, switching to US dollars, a phenomenon called domestic dollarization. When people lose faith in currency, they don't just get poorer, they exit the system altogether. So why do governments still gamble with inflation? Is it ignorance, desperation, or short-term political gain? Controlling inflation requires tough love, raising interest rates, cutting spending, and often facing recession. But history is clear: the price of avoiding these decisions is far higher. As Nobel economist Milton Friedman put it, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Can any leader truly ignore this lesson? Whether it's coin clipping or currency printing, the outcome is always the same: erosion of trust, economic chaos, and social fallout. Inflation may seem abstract, until it empties your wallet. If you found this breakdown enlightening, keep listening to stay ahead of history's repeating patterns. Understanding how inflation works isn't just smart economics, it's a form of personal and civic empowerment. Key takeaway 5. Why the 2008 financial crisis wasn't unique, and will happen again. In 2007, the American dream turned into a nightmare. Home values plummeted, families lost homes, and banks teetered on collapse. But this wasn't just a housing issue, it was a system-wide financial implosion sparked by risky subprime mortgages and fueled by reckless optimism. The instruments of disaster? Mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, financial time bombs disguised as innovation. When home prices fell, the illusion shattered, triggering a crisis that would engulf the globe. History had already warned us. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, wrote philosopher George Santayana. Yet, regulators and financiers, intoxicated by cheap credit and globalization, ignored the signs. Capital surged into the US from surplus nations like China, inflating the housing market much like Japan's real estate bubble in the 1980s or America's stock boom in the roaring 1920s. The pattern was familiar, and it ended the same way. Think of the financial system like a tower of champagne glasses. As long as the top remains steady, the flow trickles down and everything works. But when housing prices dropped, the top cracked, and the whole system collapsed. Banks had bet everything on stability that never existed, hiding fragility behind layers of complex financial products. Once homeowners defaulted, the cascade was unstoppable. Mortgage securities lost value, institutions panicked, and global markets froze. How could the world's top economists and institutions miss the cliff edge they were speeding toward? In 2007, the IMF claimed global risks were extremely low. Was it arrogance? Blind faith in modern financial tools? Or the age-old delusion that this time is different? The truth is sobering: size, complexity, and reputation don't shield nations from economic gravity. Financial bubbles are built on belief, and burst by reality. The greatest illusion of all is thinking we've outgrown history. The 2008 crisis was not a black swan, it was a rerun. And unless we learn to question easy credit, speculative euphoria, and unbridled innovation, we'll face the same collapse again. Stay informed. Stay skeptical. In summary, the book This Time is Different by Carmen M. Reinhart and Kenneth S. Rogoff take us twist and turn of financial cycle. For over 8 centuries, from medieval monarchs to modern markets, financial crises have followed a hauntingly familiar script. This Time is Different dives deep into that recurring pattern, showing that while the actors and costumes may change, the plot remains remarkably constant. Whether it's the collapse of 14th-century Florentine banks or the 2008 mortgage meltdown, the same forces, excessive borrowing, overconfidence, and denial, set the stage for economic disaster. The authors, 2 renowned economists, combined sweeping historical data with piercing analysis to prove a powerful point: no nation is immune. Even the most sophisticated economies fall prey to the belief that their unique financial systems or modern tools make them different. But as Reinhart and Rogoff reveal, the delusion of invincibility is often the spark that ignites collapse. From sovereign defaults like Argentina's in 2001 to the hidden dangers of domestic debt and banking system failures, the book uncovers how financial turmoil begins quietly, builds gradually, and then erupts suddenly. Through each example, we're reminded that crisis doesn't come out of nowhere. It's often baked into systems where risk is underestimated and accountability ignored. The authors skillfully compare ancient currency manipulations, like coin clipping and inflation by decree, to modern tools like excessive money printing and off-balance sheet lending. Despite technological progress, our tendency to gamble on perpetual prosperity remains unchanged. These stories are not just about numbers, they're about human psychology in economic disguise. One of the book's most striking insights is how domestic debt crises, often overlooked, can be just as destructive as external ones. When governments exploit their own banking systems, through inflation, forced lending, or interest rate caps, they effectively confiscate wealth from citizens. It's a sobering reminder that trust in financial institutions is both fragile and vital. Banking crises, in particular, are shown to be recurring financial earthquakes. Whether in 1930s America or 1990s Asia, they follow a predictable path: booming credit, asset bubbles, sudden panic, and painful recovery. The 2008 collapse was not a freak accident, it was a classic case of collective amnesia wrapped in innovation. Yet the ultimate danger isn't the crisis itself, it's the mistaken belief that this time is different. That seductive phrase blinds economists, governments, and investors to history's hard-earned lessons. The authors urge readers to challenge that mindset, embrace skepticism, and respect the historical patterns that warn of danger ahead. So here's the takeaway: financial literacy isn't just about money, it's about protecting freedom, security, and the ability to shape the future. If this message resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe to help spread economic awareness and empower others. And if no one told you lately, remember this: you are loved, you are worthy, and you are spectacularly capable of extraordinary things.